The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian, and thank you very much for listening in again. This week's show has a literary feel as we're talking to two authors about supernatural horror stories. Well, we are in the lead up to Christmas, which is the classic time for spooky, scary tales and storytelling. First up, I'm talking to Glynn Owen Barrass about the enduring attraction and legacy of the author H.P. Lovecraft. Yes, it's Cthulhu time here on Weird Tales. Glynn is a writer and editor of Cthulhu and mythos fiction stories and anthologies. I should add, on a personal note, that I've enjoyed working with him on a couple of anthologies that have included my own stories. Glynn also develops storylines for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game series and is one of the admins and moderators of the very popular Mythos Fiction group on Facebook. So, Glynn, good to speak to you today, and we're going to be talking about H.P. Lovecraft and why it's now 80 years since he died, but his fiction, even though a lot of it was written in the early part of the 20th century, still is very widely read and has definitely a cult status to it. What do you think is the attraction of the whole H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos?
Well, for me personally, there's something so unique about his works. The Cthulhu mythos in itself is huge. Many different elements, alien beings, gods, etc. And once you start reading it, soon after you discover this intricate history of the mythos that he integrates in his stories, spreads back eons, also forward into the future. For a writer, it's very fertile ground. You know, you can write prequels, sequels, add your own stories to the places and worlds he created. He also sparks the imagination so much, leaving parts of the horror ambiguous, whether you're a writer or a reader. As a reader, I'm reading Lovecraft, and it makes me stop and think about what he's written, especially. And this was a very good touch Lovecraft added. He would actually mix real mythology, real events with his fiction. So it's sort of, I think he called it the suspension of disbelief in the fiction. He wrote the stories, but also had you believing them. Another thing I think appeals to readers is, and it's quite nihilistic, but in his stories, it's humanity's insignificance in the universe, the hopelessness of fighting these horrors. The protagonists often fight against the horrors they discover, often using the same dark forces as the monsters are trying to destroy. These horrors are inescapable. Not too many happy endings in Lovecraft.
Yes, I was just going to say that. Yes.
Normally insanity, if you're lucky. And I think his themes are still quite unique. Another thing, say in the 1980s, the Cthulhu mythos and Lovecraft, they were like very much underground. There were occult figures, but very, very not many people, but weird fiction aficionados really knew much about them. But in the past 20 years, famous authors have come forward, like Stephen King was inspired by Lovecraft. You've got the media that fills up with Cthulhu mythos films, cartoons and stuff. And it's just so fascinating to everyone. It's his mythology in a nutshell. I think his mythology, his combined intricate mythology that often contradicts itself, but it's an addictive read, I think.
No, I mean, it's interesting, the rise and fall and rise again, because obviously he was writing in the first half of the 20th century, the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. I discovered him when I used to live in London, and I was commuting on a tube every day. So I used to be a vast consumer of paperbacks, and a whole raft of them were available in sort of the early 1970s, all with lurid covers. Yeah. And there were masses of them, and being so many, most of his are short stories. They're ideal for commuting because, you can close them and finish it between stations or whatever, and it's just ideal. And then the books all disappeared, and it became very hard to find print copies, as you say, and it just vanished.
Yeah, I was going to say a bit later, but yeah, when I discovered Lovecraft, of course, one of my first stops was the local library, and they had all the paperbacks on the list as being in stock, but they were all gone. Just a moment, my cat's jumped up in front of the PC. I'll just make sure he doesn't get the keyboard. So when I was trying to discover Lovecraft's fiction in the early 80s, tried a few libraries, the books were gone. I assume people had stolen them. And the only way to find Lovecraft really in the 80s was in those horror anthologies, I'm trying to think of Lord Halifax's Ghost Book, that kind of thing. To find one single story, they were very much almost impossible to find.
Yeah. I mean, one reason why the library books may have gone is if they were the paperback version with the little plastic sleeves that they put on, they'd probably just given up the ghost and fallen to pieces and
disintegrated.
Yes. Gone through a void in space. But I say, now you've got a situation where things like the Necronomicon is his archetypal grimoire that everything is in, that crops up in all manner of fiction, and popular fiction, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, whatever, not the Grateful Dead, what was that series of movies?
Oh, The Evil Dead.
The Evil Dead, yes.
Yeah.
With those, and it's a feature, and it's a sort of a meme, and people forget where it actually came from.
Oh yeah, The Evil Dead. It was the Necronomicus Ex Mundus, the Book of the Dead, and Bound in Human Skin, as all good books are.
Oh yes. Yes. Anyway, so what actually turned you on? You're saying when you were first looking for him, you had difficulty, but what set you off thinking, oh, this sounds an interesting writer? Was it sort of recommendations, or you'd spotted a story and were intrigued and wanted to know more?
Oh, actually, back when I was about 12, 13, I was an avid role player, playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, etc. And at my local game store, at one point, this new game appeared, Call of Cthulhu, boxed game. On the cover, there's a well-dressed 1920s ladies and gentlemen being assailed by some tentacled horror. There were also 2 sets of Cthulhu miniatures. And I thought, what the hell is going on here? So used to playing in games where you've got dungeon crawls, fighting orcs, etc. Then suddenly there's a game set in the 1920s with well-dressed ladies and gentlemen fighting tentacled abominations. So I bought this game, read it page to page, learned about Lovecraft, and And I fell in love with the Cthulhu mythos even before I'd read a single story. The first story I read was Pickman's Model, the one about the ghouls. And I found that in one of those little horror anthologies. I think it was, I don't know, Boris Karloff's Book of Ghouls or something.
Yes.
And I was just, from that point onwards, I became obsessed with finding Lovecraft stories, trawling markets, where you had the little bookstores and stuff.
Yeah.
I eventually found a paperback. And then, thankfully, in about 1987, a publisher called Grafton published his complete works in 3 volumes. Also, sorry to go back, the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, at the back of the rule book, there was an advert for Arkham House. And the Arkham House hardcover editions, his selected letters and stuff. Of course, being a child on pocket money, I couldn't afford to actually send off to America and buy these beautiful books. I've got them now, years later. But I was in quite the same boat as a lot of people in the UK in the early 80s, discovering the Call of Cthulhu game and being unable to read the actual source material. But yeah, it all goes back to me actually just finding that game. That's what got me into the mythos originally.
Some of the language in the books is quite old-fashioned, but they still appeal and they still somehow draw you into it, don't they?
Oh, yes, yeah. It's like when you read a story by Lovecraft, it's like peeling onion skins. You start off with the protagonist discovers some strange hint of things, peel back one layer, he starts to study another layer. Eventually, in a lot of stories, he discovers he himself is connected. Say, for example, The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the protagonist finally discovers that these horrible half-human monsters hunting him down, he's actually related to them. So, yeah, it's the great appeal is very much some of the stories are like detective mysteries where you peel back the layers and the horror sort of slowly and insidiously, reaches you. It's not horror that depends on blood and gore, It's more about losing one's sanity, viscous horror, and I very much like that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's odd is there haven't been that many Cthulhu mythos type movies. I mean, I keep reading about, they're going to film The Mountains of Madness or whatever, but it's a bit thin on the ground, and some of the adaptations that are out there, the one about the witch house, really doesn't have much to do with the actual story and takes off in an entirely different direction. What do you think the issue is on there?
I think really, well, I don't want to say anything bad about the likes of films like Reanimator, because I know there's a lot of people that love them, but they are, in essence, quite cheesy B-movies with lots of blood and sex and gore and stuff. And I think there's been quite a few Lovecraft, as you said, there's been quite a few films that are connected, but are not so much, they don't really cover the source material that well. There was one, I think, with Vincent Price, they called it Edgar Allan Poe's Haunted Palace in the 60s, and that was based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward. So there's been films quite loosely based on the Cthulhu mythos. We've got the Dunwich Horror in the 70s. I think the fact that most of the Cthulhu films that came out of being B-movies with a lot of blood and gore has probably not helped the movies, as in it takes away a bit of legitimacy of people's visions of Lovecraft's films when they think about stuff with blood, too much blood, and zaniness, and just campy horror.
Yeah.
That's not to say there haven't been some brilliant Lovecraft films made. There was a silent movie version of The Call of Cthulhu that was excellent. It was silent, but made in the last 2 decades and stuff. But I think probably filmmakers, if they're approached with a script to do with Lovecraft, I think they probably think about the Stuart Gordon schlock horror films and think, well, that was big in the 80s, but are people going to like that now? I think that possibly, anyway.
Moving on, I can't remember the total number of stories, because most of his work is short fiction, he's written all together, but of the whole H.P. Lovecraft canon, what's your favourite story or favourite stories?
Oh, let's see. I think, I'm just trying to think myself, I think he wrote about 60 or so, 60 or 70 stories. Probably it's a bit of a difficult one because I love a lot of his stories. Probably the one I return to repeatedly is The Whisperer in Darkness. That one, I just cannot get enough. I read that at least once a year. The way that story pans out in the Vermont woods, there's the Henley Akeley character being besieged by strange entities. It's a classic tale of alien abduction. So yeah, that is definitely my favourite.
I mean, one of the things that is interesting, as you were saying about the alien abduction, is that Lovecraft, some of it you think, well, it's just supernatural horror, but in other instances, it's quite clearly mega powerful aliens from alternative dimensions invading the Earth. So you're covering a very wide area altogether, aren't you? It's not just one thing. You could say it's fantasy, it's horror, it's science fiction.
Oh yeah, well you've got like the Migo, the fungi from Yoggoth, the Elder Things. A lot of these aliens from different worlds or dimensions, and they are scientists. They are scientists of technology. Say, for example, the great race of Yith with the Shadow Out of Time. Yeah, so it's not just supernatural beasts. It's not just entities with magical powers and things. You've got the whole range of it, and also added to that, you've got the Dreamlands.
Yes,
pretty much Lovecraft's fantasy setting.
Yes, what's that one with? I know you're a cat person. The Cats of Yulalthar, is it?
Oh, the Cats of Ulthar. Yeah. That cautionary tale where someone is it a couple that end up killing and eating some cats?
Yes.
Yes. And anyway, they end up bones, and all the cats in Ulthar are quite filled up for a few days. Yeah.
Yeah. For somebody who's not familiar with Lovecraft, what would be 2 or 3 stories to get them into it?
Oh, let's see. I would definitely say the Dunwich Horror. The Dunwich Horror would be a good start. The Whisperer in Darkness, definitely. I'm just thinking of another short one. Oh, The Dreams in the Witch House.
Yeah.
It's truly scary.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about the technology, magic and stuff, The Dreams in the Witch House, you've got witchcraft, you've got time travel, you've got dimensional travel, and you've got the Elder Things again. It's quite a wonderful mishmash of different genres.
Mm. And the other thing about Lovecraft is that he has, a bit like Sherlock Holmes summons up an image of Victorian London that you can easily get into. Lovecraft's got
Yeah.
his own geography, the whole sort of Lovecraft country, the
Oh, yes.
Miskatonic and, the university there and all the areas that you think, well, these are real places, aren't they? They sound so plausible, and it's set this whole almost like a tour guide of the areas and the different towns and things. I mean, that's another
Oh, absolutely.
fascinating aspect of it.
Arkham, I think Arkham was based on, I think, Salem.
Yeah,
I think he based Arkham on Salem, and he based his Lovecraft country, like he took New England and he added places to the map. So as well as Boston being there, which is obviously a real place, Salem, you've got Arkham and you've got Dunwich and you've got Innsmouth, all in the same geography. And also, well, his description, he was quite into his architecture and his descriptions. You've got winding paths and gambrel roofs and things. It's very beautiful.
Yes. Yeah. No. I mean, as you say, you think, well, I can envisage these places. I know what they look like. Yes. Yeah. And what about the origins? Because there are some people who say that Lovecraft himself must have taken his source from The King in Yellow. It's Robert Chambers, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, that book, well, there's a couple of them, and that story, which seems to, certainly in some elements of Lovecraft and certainly other people who follow Lovecraft and write about the same mythos area, The King in Yellow seems to have a large part to play.
Oh yeah, definitely. Lovecraft, he was inspired by a lot of horror authors, a lot of authors in general. For example, Lord Dunsany was a very big influence. And yes, Robert Chambers' King in Yellow, that story went about a book that one will read, and it drives you insane. It warps your mind. It even warps reality. I think that was a big influence on Lovecraft, on the likes of the Necronomicon and other books, like all the other mythos tomes he created. Yeah, The King in Yellow, definitely an influence on his works.
Yeah. I know you write Lovecraft fiction, but for other subsequent writers, any particular names that stand out? I mean, in the UK, we've got Ramsey Campbell, who does has delved into it. Any other names?
Well, gosh, there's so many. Robert Bloch wrote some excellent Cthulhu mythos tales. You've got these are authors, going back, who were around in Lovecraft's lifetime. You've got Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith. Again, books by these guys are thankfully ready available now because there weren't DVDs. Let's see. There's so many current Cthulhu mythos authors I could cite. Robert M. Price as an anthologist. If readers want to read new Cthulhu mythos by a lot of authors, there's anthologies edited by Robert M. Price, S.T. Joshi. I'm a big fan of Tim Curran's Cthulhu mythos works. He's written some books as sequels to At the Mountains of Madness. You could also say Jeffrey Thomas. He's written a lot of Cthulhu mythos stuff. There's too many to really say right now. Mental block.
Yes.
best thing, as I said, is anthologies that cover pretty much all the most recent Cthulhu writers. Also, in the 70s, well, from the 70s onwards, there's been books written. Children of Lovecraft, one was called. New Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos. I think Ramsey Campbell edited that, There's been a lot of collated stories in the mythos, making it quite easy to get into now.
Are you working personally on any new Lovecraft stories?
Oh, well, actually, I just recently finished a story for a collection that's just come out. It's an anthology called Ancestors and Descendants. It's actually, the theme of it is prequels and sequels to Lovecraft stories. So you've got the likes of Pickman's Model, The Shadow over Innsmouth, prequels and sequels to those. My tale I wrote was a sequel to The Whisperer in Darkness. Follows a private detective's search for answers after her client disappears, and she actually ends up following the path of the original story, ending up in that old farm in the Vermont woods.
Yeah.
So that book's available from Amazon, Book Depository, etc. But yeah, that's my most recent story. Otherwise, I'm currently writing a series of pseudo fantasy tales set in Lovecraft's Dreamlands. Like, one thing about the Dreamlands, I don't think it's been as fully explored as it should be. Lovecraft created a brilliant, well-written fantasy setting. I would say is definitely on the lines of the worlds used in Dungeons and Dragons, and even, well, I prefer it to Middle Earth. So yeah, I've been writing fantasy tales set in the Dreamlands. They've been appearing a lot in Eldritch Tales by Necronomicon Press. Eldritch Tales was a big fanzine in the 70s and 80s, and that's been revived last year. So yeah, Dreamlands Tales, this recent one for Ancestors and Descendants. Also, I've been writing a lot of Call of Cthulhu role-playing game material.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you, Glenn, for your time. That was very interesting.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Good luck with the various projects you are following, and keep in touch.
Yes, I will do.
Bye now.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Now I'm talking to Florida-based author Ben Eads about his newly released horror novella, Hollow Heart, a book described by one reviewer as a work not for the faint of heart or stomach. Ben will be talking about not just the book, but also some of the writers who have influenced him. Hello, Ben, and good to speak to you. Tell us about your new book, but obviously with no giveaways to the plots.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Charles. It's it's great to be here with you. Hollow Heart can be summed up basically by an aberration known as the Architect has finished his masterpiece, a god which slumbers beneath the hollow, determined to change the world into its own image. With the neighborhood on lockdown and the residents turned into shambling horrors, Harold and his former lover Mary begin their harrowing journey into the world within the hollow.
Right, yes. I have read the book. It is quite scary and gory.
Well, thank you so much. I deeply appreciate that.
Well, that's good, as long as you weren't going to say, well, I thought it was meant to be a moving love story. Yes.
Well, this was a children's book, and everyone was like, oh, no,
What was you mentioned just before we started recording that you live in Florida, and the setting is in the sort of Florida backwoods, would you call it, or whatever. I don't know. This is an English term. Basically, anywhere that's not New York or Los Angeles in America is the backwoods, I think. But, sort of unknown on the map. But no, seriously. Was it based, was part of the inspiration somewhere local to that you knew in that part of the world you've encountered?
Yeah, North Florida is, I mean, all the states here are weird. I mean, each state is like its own country. I mean, really.
Yeah.
And Florida is a very interesting state. We have a very big melting pot of people. I live in Central Florida, just outside of Orlando, so you could be driving down the street and you can see, the poorer communities, and the next street over is $10 million homes. Next street over, we're back to being where we were. But North Florida, except for college towns and the capital, is pretty rural. And I have family and friends that live there. So, when I had this nightmare hit me, which is the inspiration for the book, it just came naturally to put the story in a place where, I live, or close to where I live. I wanted to write a story in Florida, and I finally got my chance.
Your book is, I suppose, falls into the category of what, supernatural horror?
With just a little bit of psychological horror thrown in, yeah, but mainly supernatural horror, yes.
Yeah. And what are your sort of inspirations for it? Again, when we were discussing this interview in the past, you were mentioning the likes of M.R. James, and there's obviously H.P. Lovecraft and influences there. What are the sort of things that have influenced you in the past, your reading?
Oh, a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, I had the privilege of meeting Robert Adams, who was a kind of a, not really an international best-selling writer, but close. And I was 12 years old, mowing lawns, pushing my lawnmower around the neighborhood to make money so I could buy Nintendo games. And I met him, and I looked at his yard, and I'm like, man, that's really overgrown. I can make $20 off this guy. And I'm like, okay. After he paid me, I'm like, I got to get home and write. And he's like, you got to do what now? And I said, I got to write. And he goes, oh, you're a writer. And you're only, how old are you? And I'm like, 12. He goes, hold on. He goes in the house, comes back out with a box full of books. And he's like, you got to read these. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm really influenced by everything I read, be it J.G. Ballard, Philip K. Dick, Kurt Vonnegut. Of course, the classics, love Somerset Maugham, love David Mitchell. So when people hear, I'm influenced by writers outside of horror, they kind of take a double take, and go, what? But I love the work of Karen Russell. I love the work of Kelly Link. All of it dark, but, I don't necessarily think Karen Russell falls under horror, but definitely dark. But, mainly in regard to writing horror, yeah, man, Lovecraft, Arthur Machen, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, obviously Stephen King, Clive Barker, Neil Gaiman, people like that. But I think mainly it was the writers like Barker and Gaiman and Lovecraft who really stretched my imagination to the breaking point. And that's what I love reading in fiction, and that's what I like to do or try to do as a writer.
Yeah, no, I got you there. The books you were given when you were out cutting the lawn, were they his own books or selection of other people's books?
Well, yes, they were his, and he did have a library in his home with over 2,000 books. And I came home, and my parents were like, "What and where did you get those?" Which prompted, him coming over and saying, "Hi, I'm not, I'm just helping your son. It's nothing more than that."
Yes.
But yeah, he's like, have you heard of, Isaac Asimov? No. Have you heard of, J.G. Ballard. No. And he's like, okay, well, we'll remedy that. And so I would read a box full of books, finish them, bring them back, and then he would have another box of books for me. So at school, everybody was reading Stephen King, Clive Barker, or Anne Rice. That's it. So I'd have this, obscure Arkham House edition from the 70s, and I'm reading it, and they're like, what's that? And no one knew what it was, So I guess I was a standout at school. But, yeah, that was very kind of him. And, I was subjected to pretty much, everything, every genre out there. And I just soaked it all up, and, I'm very thankful, that he was in my life for that.
That's brilliant. Yeah. It is one of those things that you do encounter with some people and some writers, that they aren't that well read and don't realize that other people have actually already written about that or covered those topics before, and you're always, as a writer, you're always on the quest to write something different. You don't want to be, just copying somebody else's style or doing a pastiche. And I say you do need to read over a widest possible area. No, that's good. And did you then from school go on to creative writing type courses or at college or anything like that? Or
no, not at all. I was, told by Robert Adams, he's like, that's a waste of time and effort and money. And I was already writing, when I was 6 years old. And so I really didn't have any problems,
Yeah.
I mean, my teachers would be like, I need to see you after class. And I'm like, uh-oh. And, I was writing a short story that day in class, and they start reading it, and they're like, okay, all right, obviously you got talent, but this is really gory, and, can you just not write gory stuff here at school, please? Thank you very much. But yeah, I mean, I was submitting when I was in high school. That was back when you had to go to a copy machine and pay 10 cents a copy.
Yeah.
And, go to the library, print them out, and fold them up, put a self-addressed stamped envelope in there, send it off, and then, 7 days later you get your rejection in the mail. So I remember that. But I was always writing. IT, I went into IT at a very young age, and I was always writing, but I stopped submitting. But back in 2008, I started submitting again, and the rest is history. So
brilliant. Yeah. Is this your first full-length novel?
This will be my second.
Your second.
My second novella, and I mean, it's the second one to get published.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Every writer writes crap every day. It's just that, when you find gold, you harvest that gold, you nurture that gold, you take care of that gold, and move forward. And so, yes, this will be the second piece of long fiction that I've done.
Yeah. The previous one, what was that about? Was that in the same area?
That would be Crack Sky.
Yeah.
Crack Sky was published a few years ago, and it still has all the fantastical elements, that you find in my fiction. Bit more literary slant to it, bit more in that direction. And really enjoyed writing that one, And with this one, like I said, the inspiration kind of came as a nightmare, and I wrote the prologue that morning, got it banged out and done. So yeah, I'm always, looking to grow as a writer and outdo what I did last time. And, after 2 months pass, every writer I know, they're just like me. They're like, God, that sucks, and I wish I could rewrite it,
Oh, yes.
But you got to be comfortable with as lame as you were in that moment. You can just give it your best shot,
Yeah.
And, but yeah, Crack Sky is about a family who loses their daughter in a tragic car accident, and they come to find out very quickly that it was no accident, it was planned, and their daughter is being held somewhere by this very powerful supernatural, antagonist, and they have to, worm their way and figure their way out of it, and save their daughter, and they get caught up in a lot of other things along the way as well. So.
What about, I like the point you make about, you've got to accept that's as good as it's going to be for that particular book. But I do know some writers go the other way and they never actually get round to submitting because they're just forever tinkering and rewriting the same. It does obviously bring up images of Jack Nicholson in the movie typing way.
Yeah, if my girlfriend found that, she would be, very, very concerned. All work and no play makes Ben a dull boy. Ben, we have to talk.
Yes. And are you working on something else now, new?
I'm actually kind of taking a break, really, with the promotions for this book and what's involved in that and everything else. And whenever I finish a big project, we just finished final edits not too long ago. I kind of like to let my brain rest, recuperate, and then come back online. So I'll probably be writing nothing for a month or less, and then it'll start to kick in again. Because if I don't write for a while, I get kind of not myself, and I get a little wonky in the head. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to. I already have my first novel I'm working on now outlined, and I'm looking forward to digging into it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And what drew you to the type of stuff you're writing about? Was that something from a very early age? I mean, well, you get some people. I mean, there's people who write Western stories, which is something I can't read, and I can't actually imagine why you'd want to write them. But there are people who love Zane Grey and write that kind of stuff. There's something somewhere deep in the writer's psyche that says this is the stuff I want to write. What was the element with you? What got you going into supernatural psychological horror?
That's kind of like asking, well, what messed you up as a kid? It's like, what happened in your life, Ben? Here, let me give you a hug, Ben. Do you feel better? I don't, to be honest with you, I really don't know. I mean, I remember being, 3 years old, my mother later in life telling me, when you were 3, you would dress up and you would be these characters and you would play in the neighbor's front yard. And, she was 94 years old. And we were always concerned that, you would definitely get on her nerves. But we went over to talk with her and she's like, oh, no, I'm happy to see him. He's always somebody else another day. Can't wait to see what he's going to do next. So I think it was really just, an unbridled imagination that I just could not tame. And when it came to, like, after the first book I read, The Treasure of the Scroll by Valerie Reddix, that really floored me. And I was always writing, and it was funny. It was always, stuff with a darker slant. I've written science fiction, just one short story. It's very dark, though. And it's weird. It's like that's where, for me, I feel at home. I mean, these characters that I create, they've taken the paths least traveled, and I know those people. I've been friends with those people. I've seen what they've gone through, and to me, it's always, I guess, more interesting for me. I mean, whenever I try to write something, it's always horror. I mean, I don't have a choice. I don't know what it is, but I remember from a very early age, it was always horror, and nothing really kind of stood out, or I didn't watch a horror film and then go, oh, I want to recreate that. It was always horror, and I didn't know where it was coming from, but I'm happy for it. I love doing it, and I'm going to continue doing it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And you've established that other than for the dressing up, you were a normal child. It wasn't as if you were kidnapped by killer clowns and dragged away to some circus or anything that affected your childhood. But have you personally had any paranormal, supernatural experiences, seen a ghost or anything like that?
No, I have not. No.
Right.
Well,
that finished that question.
Yeah. This might interest you and the listeners too, but I was out of nowhere, a few years back. Depression reared its ugly head, and after a while, my best friend was like, "Hey, man, I'm hooked up with this shaman and this tribe, and we're doing ayahuasca, we're doing DMT, peyote. It'll help, it'll fix you." And I was really scared and reluctant, and then I started reading, white papers and scientific research on it. So yeah, I've done DMT and peyote and a whole bunch of other plant-based medicines from Peru, combo as well. And yeah, it cured the depression, got off the antidepressants, and it changed my life around. It really changed me for the better. DMT, one of the active ingredients in ayahuasca, will clean your clock. It'll get you, healthy and well. And you, of course, also go to the fourth dimension and see everything in fourth dimensional land. So I think that's really the closest I've ever come to having a quote unquote supernatural or paranormal, experience.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And can you now just give us a little update on the status of the current book, where people can buy it, what formats it's available in? Because it's only just come out, hasn't it? And you're starting to promote it now.
It will be released November 29th. We do have the pre-order up right now for the Kindle version. I think in 2 days' time or 3 days' time, the pre-order for the paperback will go online on Amazon. You can get it at Amazon.com. You can get it from, Barnes and Noble. And I'm sure, we're going to be working with some other bookstores as well to make sure, we get the book, the paperback version, in brick and mortar stores as well. And but yeah, it's going to be live on the 29th of this month. I can't wait. I'm very excited. 9 more days and counting.
Oh, that's brilliant. And obviously the Kindle will be available in all areas, and presumably the paperback will eventually be available in all regions.
Yes. And, the more
Amazon.
the merrier.
Yeah.
Yep. And we're just going to loose it upon the masses. And, like I said, very, very excited. And I hope everybody who buys a copy really enjoys reading it. I really do. I hope so.
Yeah. And I should just add that the cover artwork is particularly effective and gory. I love that. Well, it's one of those things with books, and I'm sure you saw some in all those in the past, where you wonder quite who designed the cover and had they actually read the book that they were designing the cover for, as they appear to be nothing connected to them.
Ben Baldwin, who did the cover, he is an amazing artist. And, when Crystal Lake accepted the book, he pretty much does all the covers. And I knew it was in good hands. And he really just knocked it out of the ballpark. So much love and respect to Ben Baldwin for that. He's amazing.
The book, Hollow Heart, a horror novella by Ben Eads. There's a review here by Keelan Patrick Burke saying, like the warped demonic love child of Clive Barker and Chuck Palahniuk, Ben Eads' work is not for the faint of heart or stomach. I think that's a fair summation.
I mean, it definitely is, but as you've read it, there's a lot of heart in there. There's a lot of literary aspects. And, there's some very disturbing scenes, but there's also a lot of heart in this, as you know. I mean, these characters, my main character, Harold Stowe, who's come back from Iraq, he took a bullet in the spine. And his next door neighbor, Mary, his former lover, and Harold's son, they're all kind of caught up in this, and they have to face, their fears. It chronicles the cycles of abuse, which Harold endured, the horrors of war, which Harold and Mary both endured, what it's like being a father, to an adolescent son who saw the worst in you. And, all these elements come into play. And it was just I had a blast writing it. It was like writing a surfboard, and you get your wave and a truck, going through a nitroglycerin plant could explode in your backyard and you wouldn't even notice, as you're writing it. So, but yeah, there's something in there for everybody. I definitely throw everything, including the kitchen sink, into my work, and I think there's just a little something in there for everybody. So.
That's brilliant. Well, Ben, thank you very much for your time.
One last thing. Yeah, we're doing a lot of giveaways. We're going to be, I have a signed first edition of Cujo by Stephen King, signed edition of Bird Box by Josh Mellerman, some Funko Pop horror pops. So if you sign up for my newsletter on my website at www.beneadsfiction.com, or share my posts about the book on Facebook and on Twitter, or participate in the Facebook Live events, the more that you do this, the more you spread the word, then the more apt you are to win a signed book by Stephen King, which is worth over $500. So we got that going on. There's going to be a lot of prizes. We also have the Crystal Lake Publishing Mentorship Program. You can go to crystallakepub.com, the publishers of this fine novella, and click on Author Central. We have amazing writers and editors like Kenneth W. Kane, Joe Maynard, CEO of Crystal Lake Publishing, Frank and Stephanie and Monique, who are there, and they can mentor you. They also have, editing services, and I'm there too. So check us out. If you're an aspiring writer and you're looking, to get the home field advantage, feel free to hit Joe up and we'll get you in there.
That's brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you again for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Ghosts. Here's a story in the village of Whitestone in Warwickshire, and it involves a house along a street called Gypsy Lane. And the story is the former owner of a house along there, a certain Mr. Goddard, makes his ghostly return because he was unhappy that after he died, his beloved garden was split in half and a new property was built on the site. And he apparently makes his presence known by opening locked doors, moving things around, and shorting out electrical items. Of course, it could just be a problem we all get with new houses, that the doors don't fit and the electrics aren't quite right. Maybe.
England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
And that's it. Almost out of time. Now, last week we ended with a short extract from an H.P. Lovecraft story. This week it's the turn of my favourite supernatural horror story writer, M.R. James. The story is Canon Alberic's scrapbook, and the background is a man called Dennis Toon, that's a Scottish name, has visited the old cathedral of St. Bertrand de Comminges in southwest of France. It's a real location, by the way. While Denniston is there, he purchases a 17th century scrapbook put together by Canon Alberic, who also appears to have indulged in some treasure hunting and, according to local legend, not only discovered the treasure but also the demonic creature set to guard it. The scene is late at night in Denniston's room at the inn where he is staying. His attention was caught by an object lying on the red cloth just by his elbow. 2 or 3 ideas of what it might be flitted through his brain with their own incalculable quickness. A pen wiper? No. No such thing in the house. A rat? No. Too black. A large spider? I trust to goodness, no. No. Good God! A hand like the hand in that picture. In another infinitesimal flash he had taken it in. Pale, dusky skin, covering nothing but bones and the tendons of appalling strength. Coarse black hairs, longer than ever grew on a human hand, nails rising from the end of the fingers and curving sharply down and forward, grey, horny and wrinkled. He flew out of his chair with deadly inconceivable terror clutching at his heart. The shape, whose left hand rested on the table, was rising to a standing posture behind his seat, its right hand crooked above its scalp. There was a black and tattered drapery about it. The coarse hair covered it, as in the drawing. This is a drawing that's in Canon Alberic's scrapbook. The lower jaw was thin. What can I call it? Shallow, like a beast's. Teeth showed behind the black lips. There was no nose. The eyes of a fiery yellow, against which the pupils showed black and intense, and the exulting hate and thirst to destroy life which shone there were the most horrifying features in the whole vision. There was intelligence of a kind in them, intelligence beyond that of a beast, but below that of a man. And it just remains for me to say thank you for listening, and I hope you join me again same time next week. Till next time, this is Charles Christian saying, stay well, stay different, and don't worry about that thing you can see out of the corner of your eye. It's probably only a spider. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.